The wolf put its head over the rim of Dessa's pot before she could pull the ladle back, and it lapped the broth straight from the metal, slow and deliberate, while across the yard, dressed in a string of borrowed pearls for a binding ceremony that had not happened yet, the woman they meant to make Luna by midsummer had not been offered so much as a taste. Nobody moved. The fire under the cauldron kept its low orange breath going, indifferent. Steam climbed off the broth into the cold morning air, and the wolf's eyes, pale amber, unblinking, stayed fixed on Dessa's hands the whole time it drank, as though it were watching for her permission rather than taking what it wanted. She gave it. She did not know why, only that refusing felt like the wrong kind of danger, the kind that lived in a held breath rather than a raised hand. So she let the ladle tip another inch, and the Alpha King's wolf finished what was in it, and then it sat back on its haunches in the mud of her kitchen yard and looked at her the way nothing in this castle had looked at her in 6 years, like she was the only thing in the courtyard worth seeing. Dessa Holloway had come to the border kitchens of Garrick Thane's pack territory as a girl of 18, sent by a dissolved household with nothing but a name nobody bothered to learn and a set of hands that knew what to do with a knife and a fire. 6 years had taught her the particular invisibility of competence. Nobody watched the woman who fed 400 wolves 3 times a day. They watched the food arrive on time, and they forgot, almost immediately, that a person had made it arrive. Her hands told the story her face never had the chance to. A burn scar crossed the inside of her left wrist, pale and shiny, from the year she'd pulled a kitchen boy back from a cauldron that had gone over. Calluses ridged the base of each finger from the handle of a cleaver she sharpened herself, because she trusted no one else to do it properly. When the pressure of a long night built behind her ribs, she pressed her thumb hard into the heel of her own palm, once, twice, until the urge to say something she'd regret passed through her and out the other side. She had done it so many times, the motion no longer required thought. The border keep itself was not built for ceremony, and that suited her. Where the capital court 4 days' ride east wore stone polished smooth by 3 centuries of formal feet, Garrick Thane's territory kept its hierarchy looser, its halls built for defense rather than display. The great hall doubled as a war room more often than a banquet room. Wolves moved through the courtyards at all hours, some in skin, some in fur, and rank here was decided as often by who could be trusted in a fight as by who held a title. It was the kind of place where a cook's competence carried more practical weight than a noblewoman's bloodline, even if no one had ever said so to Dessa's face. She had come to understand, over 6 years, that this was the closest thing to safety a woman with no name and no house could hope to find. She did not think of herself as beautiful, and the kitchen had never given her reason to. But the undercook who delivered grain sacks twice a week had taken, over the years, to finding excuses to linger in the doorway a half-minute longer than the delivery required, and he was not the only one. It was not a thing she noticed about herself. It was a thing that happened around her, like weather she had stopped checking the sky for. The pack territory she lived inside of belonged to Garrick Thane, an Alpha King who had held his border seat for 9 years, without once, in that time, allowing his wolf to choose anything for him in public. The wolf did not run free among the pack the way other alphas let theirs run. It stayed close, contained, watchful. A thing the court had learned not to ask questions about, the way you learn not to ask a man about an old wound that has healed wrong. Garrick moved through his own halls like weather held just barely in check. He did not raise his voice, because he had never needed to. The air around him did the work a raised voice did for lesser men, and rooms went quiet a half-second before he entered them, rather than after. His voice, when he used it, had a low, worn texture to it, like a stone smoothed by a river that had been running over it for longer than anyone in the room had been alive. People who met him for the first time were braced for something showy, and found instead a stillness so complete it unsettled them more than shouting would have. He had not touched another person's hand in greeting for 3 years. His beater, Bram Ostland, had stopped commenting on it after the first year. It was simply how the Alpha King was, until the morning his wolf walked itself across a working kitchen yard and put its head down for a servant's broth. Bram saw it happen. He stood in the kitchen doorway with a requisition ledger under his arm and watched the wolf's posture, loose, unguarded, nothing like the coiled vigilance it carried everywhere else, and felt something in his own chest go very still. He had served Garrick Thane for 9 years. He had never once seen the wolf's shoulders drop like that. He said nothing to Dessa. He turned and went to find the Alpha King instead, and found him already awake in his study, already aware, in the specific dazed way of a man recovering from having done something his conscious mind had not approved. Garrick stood at the window, with both hands flat on the stone sill, looking down at the kitchen yard where his wolf had been a moment before he called it back, hard, the way you call back a dog that has crossed a line you did not draw. He could feel the place in his chest where the wolf still strained toward the yard even now, even contained, even silent. He had not chosen that. That was the part that sat wrong in him, low and persistent. Every other decision he had made in 9 years of rule had been made with both feet under him and his eyes open. This had happened the way weather happens, without his consent, without his understanding, while some other, older part of him simply acted. He did not know the cook's name. He found, standing at that window, that he wanted to. Lady Yseult Coraine arrived at the border keep 4 days later, with an entourage of 11 and a treaty her father had negotiated before she was old enough to read it. The binding between her house and Garrick Thane's had been drawn up after the last border war, 2 pacts sealing peace the old way, with a marriage promised before either party involved had any say in the matter. She had grown up understanding herself as the answer to a political problem. She was very good at being the answer. She moved through the keep with the unhurried correctness of someone who had never once doubted her welcome, and the kitchen staff learned within a day that she preferred her meals plain, her wine slightly warmed, and her servants invisible in the specific way that meant present but never spoken to first. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Doors opened for her before she reached them, the way they had stopped opening unprompted for Dessa 6 years ago. She had heard, by the second day, about the wolf in the kitchen yard. She filed the information the way she filed everything, without visible reaction, with a small private recalculation behind her eyes, and said nothing about it to anyone. The wolf came back the next morning, and the one after that. It did not announce itself. It simply appeared at the kitchen door each dawn, while Dessa hauled water for the first broth of the day, and it sat, patient as stone, until she filled a bowl and set it down without ceremony, the way she would have fed any animal that turned up hungry. She did not treat it as anything but what it appeared to be. That, more than anything else, was what undid the wolf's last reserve. She asked nothing of it, performed nothing for it, simply fed it because it was there and hungry, the same as she fed everyone else. By the 5th morning, half the kitchen staff had stopped working entirely to watch. By the 6th, Bram Ostland stood in the doorway again, and this time the Alpha King stood directly behind him. Garrick saw his wolf lower its head into a wooden bowl held by a woman with flour on her sleeve and a burn scar at her wrist, and something in his chest dropped through several floors at once. He had spent 3 years building a careful architecture around the parts of himself he did not trust. He watched it come down in the space of one indrawn breath. She looked up and saw him in the doorway, and for one unguarded second, neither of them performed anything at all. "You're the cook," he said. It was not a question, but his voice did something at the end of it that made it sound like one. "Dessa," she said. She did not curtsy. Her hands were still wet from the water bucket, and she did not have a free one to spare for ceremony. "Holloway, I've been here 6 years, my lord. I don't know that we've spoken." "We haven't," he said. The wolf, between them, looked from one to the other and made a low sound in its chest that was not quite a growl and not quite anything else either. Garrick's jaw tightened at the sound, the way a man's jaw tightens around a thing he is choosing, with effort not to say. That evening, the castle's wise archivist, an old man named Maddox Greel, who had outlived 3 Alpha Kings and stopped pretending to care about rank somewhere around the second one, found Dessa in the kitchen storeroom counting salt barrels and told her, without preamble, that she should sit down. 308 years, he said, when she had. That's how long it's been since an Alpha King's wolf took food from a hand that wasn't his bonded mate's. 308 years since the last true Luna of this line died, and the wolf that had chosen her went half feral with grief, and never let another living soul near it again. Generation after generation, king after king. Every wolf since has been a shadow of what that one was. Contained, careful, closed. That doesn't mean anything about me, Dessa said. It means the wolf chose, Maddox said. Not the king, the wolf, on its own, before the man caught up to it. That has not happened in 308 years, girl, and it did not happen for a noblewoman in silk or a warrior with a blade at her hip. It happened for the woman who fed it, because it was hungry and asked nothing in return. He left her sitting on a salt barrel with that number lodged somewhere behind her ribs, heavy in a way she had no place to put down. What the archivist did not say, because he did not yet know it, was that Dessa had been doing the same quiet, unasked-for thing in another corner of the keep for 3 months already. An orphaned pup, the runt of a litter whose mother had died birthing him, had been left in the kennels to fend for himself, the way runts often were, because the keep had wolves enough without one more mouth that might not survive the winter. Dessa had found him shivering against the kennel wall on a delivery run, and had simply started bringing him scraps, then a proper bowl, then a corner of the kitchen hearth to sleep beside on the coldest nights. She had not told anyone. She had not asked permission. She had named him, privately, Crumb, because that was what he'd been eating when she found him, and she had nursed him through a fever in February that the kennel master had quietly assumed would kill him. Nobody had witnessed any of it. She had not done it to be witnessed. Garrick found out by accident, 3 days after the archivist's conversation, when he went looking for his wolf at an hour it should have been in the kennels, and instead found it curled in the kitchen hearth corner, nose to tail with a half-grown pup that had no business surviving its first winter, and had survived it anyway, both of them asleep in the warm dark, while Dessa worked 20 feet away, humming low under her breath, unaware she had an audience. He stood in the doorway and did not enter. He stayed there long enough that his legs should have complained about it, and they did not, because for once in 9 years he was not holding anything together. He was simply watching a woman take care of something small and broken because it was there and needed care, the same unceremonious way she had fed his wolf, and something in his chest that had been clenched since the day his mother died came slowly, painfully, open. His wolf was not the one who recognized her first. Garrick had spent 3 years telling himself the wolf was the wild part of him, the part he kept contained because it could not be trusted to choose wisely. Standing in that doorway, watching her hum over a pot while an orphaned pup slept against his wolf's flank, he understood with sudden, unwelcome clarity that he had already chosen. He had simply not let himself say so. The wolf had only confirmed, in its blunt animal way, what the man had been suppressing since the morning he first watched her hands at the well. He left before either of them woke, and found him there. The first time he sought her out on purpose, rather than finding her by accident, it was over something that did not require an Alpha King's personal attention at all. A question about the kitchen's grain stores that any steward could have asked. She knew it, and from the way his mouth tightened at one corner, so did he, and neither of them said so. "You didn't need to come yourself," she said. "No," he agreed, and did not explain himself further, and stood in her storeroom a full minute longer than the question required, looking at the burn scar on her wrist, as though it were a map of somewhere he wanted to go. She reached past him for a sack of barley, and their hands brushed at the seam of it. Barely anything. A half-second of contact neither of them had planned. and he went very still, the way a man goes still when something has landed too close to a wound he has spent years protecting. "My lord," she said, low. "Garrick," he said, "when it's just this room." He left without taking the answer about the grain stores he'd supposedly come for. She stood holding the barley sack for a long moment after the door closed, feeling the place on the back of her hand where his fingers had crossed hers, and did not examine too closely why she pressed her thumb into her palm twice before she went back to work. Lady Yseult began to notice the shape of what was happening before the kitchen staff finished gossiping about it. She noticed the way Bran Ostlin's eyes flicked toward the kitchen wing during council meetings. She noticed that the Alpha King had stopped attending the formal dinners she had been seated beside him for, twice now, claiming border business that no one bothered to verify. She did not raise her voice about any of it. She filed a formal concern with the keep's steward instead, citing irregularities in the kitchen accounts, a discrepancy in the salt ledger, an unauthorized animal kept on castle grounds without registration, a servant exceeding the bounds of her station in matters that touched the binding treaty between two houses. It was, on paper, entirely correct. Every word of it followed proper procedure. That was the danger of her, the thing the kitchen staff had learned within a day, and Dessa had not yet fully understood. Yseult Coran did not need to lie, or shout, or strike anyone, to take everything from a person. She only needed the institution's own rules, applied with patient precision to a target who had no standing to refuse them. The steward, who answered to the treaty before he answered to anyone's wolf, suspended Dessa from kitchen duties pending review and ordered the pup removed from the grounds within the week. Alone in her apartments that same evening, Lady Yseult Coran sat at her writing table with the steward's signed order in front of her, and did not move for a long time. To the household she had shown nothing but cool, formal correctness since the day she arrived. Alone, with no one watching, her hand pressed flat against the table's edge hard enough to whiten the knuckles, and for one unguarded moment her composure slipped entirely. The careful mask of a woman who had spent her whole life being told exactly what she was worth giving way to something rawer underneath. Not triumph, but a kind of desperate arithmetic, the look of someone protecting a position she had spent years building rather than a person enjoying a victory. She smoothed her hand flat again, folded the order, and by morning no one would have guessed it had ever cracked at all. The night before the suspension order arrived, before any of it had turned to council business and paperwork, there had been an evening with no plot in it at all. Garrick had found her shelling a basket of late beans by the kitchen fire, Crumb asleep across her feet, and instead of saying anything, he had simply sat down across from her and picked up a handful of the beans himself, working in silence beside her for the better part of an hour. He was terrible at it. He split the pods wrong and scattered half the beans across the floor for the pup to chase, and she laughed at him, properly, for the first time since he'd known her, and he found he did not mind being laughed at in the slightest. Neither of them mentioned the council session 4 days off, or Lady Coraine, or anything that mattered beyond the small, unhurried fact of two people sitting by a fire doing something useless together because it was easier than being apart. Dessa heard the suspension order the following morning, standing in the same storeroom where Maddox Greel had told her about 308 years, and felt the floor of her good fortune drop away as quickly as it had opened. "On what grounds?" she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, because steadiness was the only thing 6 years of invisibility had ever taught her to produce on command. "On the grounds that you are not, and have never been, anyone of consequence to this keep's treaty obligations," the steward said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "Whatever the wolf has decided is not a matter of policy, Mistress Holloway. The binding between Lady Coraine's house and the Alpha King's was settled before either of you was born. I am sorry, I am bound by older paper than you." That night, in the kitchen's banked-down quiet, after the last meal had gone out, Garrick found her sitting on the hearthstone, with Crumb curled against her side, both of them very still, and did not say anything for a long moment. He simply sat down on the stone beside her, close enough that his shoulder rested against hers, and let the silence hold the shape of everything neither of them knew how to say yet. "They're sending him to the border kennels," she said finally. "He won't survive a winter there alone. He barely survived this one with me." "I know," Garrick said. "And me." He turned his head and looked at her, and for once did nothing to disguise what was in his face. "You are not going anywhere," he said. "I have simply not yet worked out how to say so in a way the council cannot unwind with paperwork." She laughed, short and disbelieving, and some of the rigid line of her shoulders came down. He reached over, slow enough that she could have pulled away, and cupped the side of her face with one hand, his thumb resting just below the burn scar's twin on the inside of her wrist, where her pulse beat against his skin. She leaned into it before she decided to, the way the wolf had leaned into her permission 6 mornings running, and for a moment that had no plot in it at all, no treaty and no council, and no antagonist's shadow. They simply sat together on the warm stone, while the fire burned low, and the pup slept between them. It did not solve anything. It was not meant to. It was only proof that something in both of them had already decided, long before either of them had the standing to say so out loud. The council convened 9 days later to formalize the binding between House Corraine and the Alpha King's line, and Lady Yseult arrived dressed for a victory she had spent 3 months assuming was already won. Dessa stood at the back of the hall in her kitchen clothes because the steward's suspension order had never been lifted, and Garrick had not yet found the legal lever to lift it, and she had come anyway because Maddox Greel had told her, the night before, that some things were worth standing for, even from the back of a room. "My lord," Yseult said, when the formal business had been read, "before this council ratifies a binding 9 years in the making, I believe the matter of the kitchen servant requires resolution. A wolf's confusion is not grounds to set aside a treaty signed by 2 houses and witnessed by a war's end." "It is not confusion," Garrick said. "Then what would you call it?" she said, and her voice stayed perfectly civil, perfectly correct, the voice of a woman who had never once needed to raise it to win a room. "A wolf that has not chosen in 3 centuries chooses, conveniently, the one person whose elevation would dissolve every political obligation standing in her way. Forgive me if I find the timing remarkable." It was Maddox Greel who answered her, rising slowly from his seat at the council's edge, with the particular unhurried authority of a man who had stopped fearing anyone's rank decades ago. "I have kept this keep's records for 41 years, he said. "I have read every account of every Alpha King's wolf this line has produced back to its founding, and I will tell this council plainly, a wolf cannot be paid, flattered, or politically persuaded. It has no stake in treaties. It cannot be bribed with elevation, because it does not understand elevation. It chose this woman across 6 mornings before anyone in this hall knew her name, while she fed it without asking for anything, the same way she has fed an orphaned pup for 3 months without telling a soul. If Lady Corraine wishes to suggest the wolf was manipulated, I invite her to explain how a servant with no standing, no wealth, and no knowledge that the wolf's choice carried any weight at all, orchestrated a political maneuver 308 years in the making. A silence opened in the hall, the kind that has weight to it. Lady Corraine's composure did not break, but her gaze moved once, briefly, to the back of the hall, to the woman in kitchen clothes, standing where a suspension order said she had no right to stand at all. "Then I am to understand," she said, each word measured, "that this council is asked to believe a 300-year silence ended for a servant who scrubs pots, on no evidence beyond an old man's records and an animal's behavior." "The evidence," Maddox said, "is that I have catalogued every recorded instance of this line's wolf refusing food from any hand but a bonded mate's for 41 years, and I have never once seen a deviation, not for visiting royalty, not for the Alpha King's own mother in her final illness, not for anyone, until 6 mornings running, in a kitchen yard, witnessed by no fewer than 9 members of this household, before any political stake existed for anyone to manufacture. I would ask the council which is more remarkable, that an old wolf finally chose, or that a noble woman finds a servant's kindness so impossible to credit that she would rather suspect a conspiracy. "And the salt ledger discrepancy you raised, my lady," Maddox added, almost gently, "was an error in the steward's own arithmetic, corrected in this keep's records 11 days before your formal complaint was filed. I checked this morning, because I suspected you had not." Something moved behind Isolde Corrain's composure for the first time since she had arrived at the keep. Not anger, not yet, but the first flicker of a woman recalculating a position she had believed unassailable. She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to, and she did not start now. But her hands, folded in front of her, tightened until the knuckles went pale, and the court, watching, understood that they were seeing the only crack she would allow them. "The treaty," she said, more carefully now, "still stands. A wolf's preference does not unmake a binding sealed in blood and signature." "No," Garrick agreed, and stood, and the room's attention moved to him the way it always did, a half-second of stillness before he spoke rather than after. "It does not. But the binding your father negotiated, my lady, was a promise of alliance between 2 houses against future conflict. It was never a claim on my person, and it was never drafted as one. I had the original document retrieved from this keep's archive 3 days ago, when I first suspected this council session was coming. Your father's treaty secures trade rights, mutual defense, and open passage along the border for the next 2 generations. It does not, anywhere in its 11 clauses, name a marriage. That clause was added 8 years later, in your father's hand, without my father's countersignature, and it has no legal standing in this hall or any other." He let that sit a moment in the silence before he continued. "Your house's alliance with mine remains exactly as strong as your father built it. I will honor every clause your father actually signed. I will not honor a clause invented after the fact and never witnessed." Isolde Corrain stood very still in the center of the hall, and for the first time since she had walked into the keep with 11 attendants and a victory she had assumed was already won, what showed in her eyes was not defiance. It was something closer to fear, the particular fear of a woman who had built her entire understanding of her own worth on a document that had just been proven, in front of a full council, to have been a fiction from the start. "I will need to review the document," she said finally, and her voice, for the first time, was not entirely steady. "You may," Garrick said. "Master Greel will provide a copy. Your alliance stands. Your claim on me does not, and never did." She left the hall within the hour, her entourage trailing behind her, in a silence that had nothing rehearsed in it at all. No one struck her. No one shamed her publicly beyond what the truth itself had already done. Her house's alliance held, intact, exactly as her father had built it, and the marriage she had spent her whole life understanding, as her purpose, dissolved into the 11 clauses that had actually been signed. She rode out of the border keep 3 days later, her claim nullified, her person untouched, and the court understood that this was its own kind of ending, cleaner and somehow more unsettling than any dramatic downfall would have been. Word reached the border keep within the month that Lord Corrain, Isolde's father, was furious at the dissolution of a match he had spent 8 years quietly engineering, and for a tense week the household braced for retaliation, a recalled trade agreement, a closed border crossing, something. It never came. Isolde herself, in the one letter she sent back to the keep, addressed not to Garrick, but to Maddox Greel, asked only that the archivist confirm in writing, for her father's sake, that the original treaty's 11 clauses remained untouched and her house's alliance secure. Maddox sent the confirmation by return courier within the day. Whatever else Isolde Corrain had lost in that council hall, she had not lost the thing her father actually valued, and she made certain, in her own quiet and correct way, that everyone understood it. No further word came from House Corrain. The border held, exactly as it always had. Dessa's suspension was lifted before the council session had fully ended. The steward, reading the original treaty with his own eyes for the first time in years, signed the order himself without being asked twice. The weeks that followed did not announce themselves the way the confrontation had. They simply arrived, one quiet morning after another, and stayed. The wolf no longer waited at the kitchen door for permission. It came and went through the keep as it pleased, curling by the kitchen hearth most mornings beside a pup who had grown, over the winter, from a shivering scrap of fur into a sturdy young thing with paws too big for the rest of him, tripping over his own feet across the kitchen flagstones, while the cook stepped around him without comment, the way you step around any fixture of a household that has simply always been there. Garrick came to the kitchen most mornings now, not because anything required it, but because it was where she was. He had stopped pretending the visits needed a reason. The steward had long since stopped questioning the Alpha King's habit of taking his first meal standing in the kitchen doorway with a bowl in his hand, talking to the cook about nothing in particular, while his wolf dozed by the hearth and a half-grown pup chewed on the hem of someone's apron. Garrick came to the kitchen most mornings now, not because anything required it, but because it was where she was. He had stopped pretending the visits needed a reason. The steward had long since stopped questioning the Alpha King's habit of taking his first meal standing in the kitchen doorway with a bowl in his hand, talking to the cook about nothing in particular, while his wolf dozed by the hearth and a half-grown pup chewed on the hem of someone's apron. The kitchen staff, who had spent 6 years barely registering Dessa as anything beyond the person who made the food arrive on time, had stopped finding it strange to see the Alpha King leaning against the doorframe with flour dust on his sleeve from where he'd reached past her for something. Iona Brisk, who had shown Dessa more kindness than anyone else in that kitchen during her first invisible years there, took to teasing her gently about it when the two of them salted the morning's bread alone, and Dessa let herself be teased in a way the old, careful version of herself never would have allowed. Bram Ostland had taken to bringing the requisition ledgers to the kitchen door instead of the study, on the theory, never spoken aloud, that the Alpha King answered questions more readily with a bowl of broth in his hand than a council agenda in front of him. He was not wrong. He had changed in ways the court noticed without naming. He touched people's hands again, in passing, in greeting. Not many, not often, but the door that had been shut for 3 years stood open now, and everyone in the keep understood, without being told, why. He remembered small things she had said in passing weeks before, and brought them up again at unexpected moments, the way a man does when another person has become someone he is paying close attention to, rather than someone he is simply tolerating. Once in front of the full council, he moved her papers off a table where someone had set down a wet cup, without being asked, without comment, and continued the meeting as though nothing had happened. She noticed. She did not say anything either. Some things did not need to be said to be understood. By stage's end, what the wolf had begun in a kitchen yard, the man had carried so far past it that no one in the keep mistook the wolf's choice for the whole of the story any longer. The wolf had chosen first, but it was Garrick who had built, morning after deliberate morning, the life that choice now lived inside of. On a morning in early spring, with the worst of the cold finally broken and Crumb sprawled in a patch of sun by the hearth, Garrick found her alone in the storeroom, counting salt barrels the way she had been doing the first night Maddox Greel told her a number that changed everything. He took the tally slate gently out of her hands and set it down, and she let him, because by then she had learned the difference between the times he wanted something from her and the times he simply wanted her. 308 years, he said. That's how long the wolf waited. I think I waited almost as long, in my own way, without knowing what I was waiting for. And now, she said. Now I'm not waiting for anything, he said, and kissed her, unhurried, certain, his hand still cupping her face, the way it had on the hearthstone, the night everything nearly came apart. Except this time, there was no treaty hanging over either of them, no counsel, waiting to unmake what they had decided. It was not a public spectacle. No one witnessed it but the wolf, dozing by the fire, and the pup, who did not look up at all, because by then the two of them together was simply how the kitchen was, every ordinary morning, the same as bread rising or water boiling. She had spent 6 years being the woman nobody watched. She had spent 308 years' worth of history being the first person an old, broken thing had chosen to trust again. And on this particular morning, with salt barrels still uncounted and a pup snoring in a patch of sun, she understood that the two things had never actually been in competition. She had been worth seeing the entire time. It had simply taken the right eyes, finally, to look. If a wolf that has not chosen in 3 centuries chose you, across 6 quiet mornings, before you had any idea your kindness was being witnessed at all, would you have noticed it happening, or only understood afterward, the way Dessa did, that the choosing had already changed everything? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time.